As we talk about hot standby routing protocol and see it in action, which is going to be very shortly, we've got several great HSRP labs for you in this section. I'm going to be referring to routers rather than saying switches or L3 switches or multi-layer switches, because the HSRP terminology itself does refer to active routers and standby routers. The theory and commands of HSRP, they run the same on a multi-layer switch as they do on a router, and in the lab we actually will be using multi-layer switches. Also, the icon that I'm using for multi-layer switches from here on out is slightly different. There's no SI in the middle. I just wanted to make sure that you saw both versions of that. Now, HSRP is defined in RFC 2281, and it's a Cisco proprietary router redundancy protocol. What we're doing is we're putting physical routers into an HSRP router group. One of the routers in the group is going to be selected as the active router. The others are going to be the standby routers. And it will not surprise you to learn at this point that the active router is going to handle the actual workload, and the standby routers, frankly, are going to sit there and they're going to stand by and watch the active router do all the work. Now, HSRP does ensure a high network time because we are routing IP traffic without reliance on a single router. Also, just a quick note here, the terms active and standby, they don't refer to the actual operational status of the routers. The backup router or the standby router, it doesn't go into some kind of suspended state. It's ready to go. It's just referring to its status in the HSRP group. Here's actually what we're doing with HSRP. Now, the actual IP and MAC addresses of the physical routers in the group, they're totally unknown to downstream devices, and in this case that being our switch and a bunch of hosts connected to that switch. These devices are actually communicating with a router that does not exist, a pseudo router, a more popular term, a virtual router, and that's going to be created by the HSRP configuration. Now, this virtual router is going to have its own MAC address, it's going to have an IP address that we assign it, and the downstream devices send data using those as the destination addresses. It's pretty cool stuff. So we're going to jump right in here with a lab. And in our first lab, we're going to have multi-layer switch 1, which has an interface VLAN 100 with an IP address of 172.16.23.1, and multi-layer switch 2, which also has an interface VLAN 100, address 172.16.23.2. Those are the two routers we're putting in the HSRP group. We're going to create a virtual router with this configuration with the IP address 172.16.23.12/24, and it's that address that will be used by all the hosts in VLAN 100 as the default gateway. So here's a diagram for you as well showing you those addresses, and let's go ahead and get started. Let's bring the live equipment up. Now, I have pre-created, if you will, I've already created the interface VLAN 100 on both devices. And we'll just do a quick verification here. Here's show VLAN 100. It's up and up. There's the IP address 172.16.23.2. Now let's go over to multi-layer switch 1, MLS 1. You can see, whoops, that should be 100. There we go. And interface VLAN 100 is up. Everything looks good there. 172.16.23.1/24 is the IP address. Just wanted to make sure I did show you VLAN 100 for number 2. Okay, so those again are the IP addresses that we're working with, the two devices, and we're going to create this virtual router at 172.16.23.12/24. We're going to start over on router 2. And these are interface level commands. Standby is the word we just keep coming back to. You are rarely, if ever, even going to type HSRP. But standby, I've got quite a few options here. Some we're going to look at in the next couple of labs. And the one we're going to look at right now is your only required one, IP. And that's enabling HSRP for IP version 4 and setting the virtual IP address, which is a good idea. So without that, we're kind of stuck. So let's see what we need before that, though. We actually need a group number, and I'm going to put 5 for ours. And I'm going to then enable HSRP for IP version 4 with IP. Then I'm putting my virtual address, 172.16.23.12. You could make it a secondary virtual IP address. I'm not that much on secondary addresses, and that's not something we're going to cover in the labs anyway. It's beyond the scope of the exam. And we're just going to stop right there and see if anything happens. We'll get a little console message, and let's run show standby. We're going to be running this one a lot. And state is listen at the very top. And I'm going to show you all the states. We'll discuss those and look at the order of them. But right now it's just listening for something. And let's go ahead and finish the config over on MLS 1. Standby 5, IP 172.16.23.12. And that's it. Now let's go back over to switch 2. This may take a minute or two to finish cooking, so to speak. As you can see, state is active. It's showing a couple of state changes. We see the virtual IP address. There's an active virtual MAC address as well. We didn't enter that, but there is one. And let's see. Standby router still unknown. So let's give that a moment to cook, so to speak, and let them talk to each other. And now you can see it's changed from standby router is unknown to a few seconds later, standby router is 172.16.23.1, priority 100. And it looks like things might have settled right there. So you can see we had another state change. That's been about 53 seconds. This is the active router. Active router is local. Standby router is 172.16.23.1, which is router 1. So let's just go ahead and verify that. Trust but verify. Show standby. Group 5, you can see that one state change was about 44 seconds ago. The state is standby. There's the same virtual IP MAC address. We expect that. There's the same virtual MAC address. Something called preemption is disabled. You see the active router, 172.16.23.2. We see its priority, and there's the standby router is local and the priority of the local router. So far, so good. That's exactly what we expected to see. What we saw on switch 1 verified what we saw on switch 2. And let's go down. We've seen all this on the board. One thing I did want to show you here, you cannot assign an IP address from the multi-layer switch as the IP address for the virtual router. And here on this line, I tried that. Standby 5 IP 172.16.23.1. The router told me address cannot equal interface IP address. I'm the one who added, so don't try it. Cisco doesn't have that much of a sense of humor, but I do. So let's go down the roll here, down the line. We'll start with MLS 2. And let's go down this information one more time, because you're going to go to show standby. This is your number one verification command. It's your number one troubleshooting command. You're going to keep coming back to this, so we really need to know the information we can expect to find. First off, here's your VLAN number, and it's in group 5. State is active, and again, we'll come back to those states here shortly. We've had 2 state changes, and the last state change was 2.5 minutes ago. If you see these continually changing in what you think should be a stable configuration, then that's a tip-off that it's not a stable configuration. You've got something wrong. There's no reason for HSRP state changes to be a regular thing, like every couple of minutes. Definitely shouldn't happen. There's our virtual IP address for the router itself, the virtual router. Again, there's that MAC address. And you notice V1 default here. Version 2, I believe, is for IP version 6, and that is way beyond the scope of the NP switch exam as far as HSRP goes. So we've got our hello time here of 3 seconds and a hold time of 10 seconds. Those must be the defaults because we didn't send them. It even tells you when the next hello will be sent, down to the thousandth of a second. That's pretty exact. Preemption, again, is disabled. We'll talk about that shortly, I have a feeling. Active router is local. There's our standby router 23.1. Even tells you what the priority is. Tells you the priority of the local device. And then finally the group name, not something we get into a lot, but that is the default name, and you'll notice the group number is at the end of the default name. So a treasure trove of HSRP information in there. Tells you the states, the IP addresses of the standby, tells you whether you're the active or not. A lot of great stuff. If we go back over to switch 1, And let's get a fresh show standby there. We have the same fields, just of course the information is a little bit different. You can see the last state change was almost 4 minutes ago. State is standby. There's that virtual IP. Let's talk about that virtual MAC address though. We know where the IP address came from. We're the ones that entered it. That's the one required command you have. Well, where did that MAC address come from? This is derived from the well-known MAC address that's reserved for HSRP. So most of that address was predetermined. Almost all of it actually, 0000C, 07, AC, all of that is predetermined. The 05 here, that's the only part that isn't predetermined. Now that is the group number, and I know you're saying, hey, no kidding, but it's the group number in hex. So you need to brush up on your hexadecimal before you take the switch exam because that could creep in. And of course, if you saw AC0A here, the group number would actually be 10. If you didn't know that, you do need to brush up on your hex. Nothing wrong with that. Just a quick story here. It was a long time before I even started running courses like this. And it had been a very, very, very long time since I saw hex on any certification exam, anything. And the day I took the CCIE lab, there was some hex at the very beginning of it. And if you couldn't solve this, then you couldn't do the rest of the lab. So I had to wait until some brain cells came back there after a few minutes. There was a moment of panic, but you don't want that panic on your exam. So just take a few minutes to brush up on your hex before you take the switch exam, and you will be fine. But that is exactly where the MAC address comes from. And here's our current network. MLS2 is the active switch, MLS1 is the standby switch, our virtual router 172.16.23.12. That also concludes our first lab. What we're going to do next is talk about that election process and how to change the results if we're not real crazy about it. We'll do that in a lab at the beginning of the very next video. See you there.